All right, well, here we go again. We're going to talk about the first chapter of Mark 1, the way of the Lord and the geography of discipleship. That is our theme for today. Last time we talked, we were focusing on what does it mean to say that this is the gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And today we're going to be talking about the way of the Lord and the geography of discipleship. And this comes starting looking at verse 2 primarily, where it says, and it is written in the prophet Isaiah. And then there's these two quotes that talk about the way of the Lord in the wilderness. And by starting off his gospel, it's really like in Star Wars, when you have that long scrolling kind of setup, the narrative that kind of sets up what's happening, that scrolls through. The book of Isaiah really is kind of the whole context that Mark uses all throughout his gospel. And so he's constantly pulling from different themes. And so here he quotes these two passages that talk about the way of the Lord in the wilderness, but he's also going to be talking about two different figures all throughout the gospel, which is the figure of the powerful Messiah, along with the figure of the suffering servant. And so in the book of Isaiah, it speaks about how the people are in captivity, and God is going to make a way through the desert from Babylon in captivity. He's going to kind of prepare a highway through the desert all the way back to Israel, to Jerusalem, and bring his people back on this highway. And we know, according to the Gospel of John, that Jesus himself is called the way, that he is the way, the truth, and the life. And so Mark isn't just saying that Jesus is going to take us on that way, but rather that he's going to disciple us into the way of being Christ-like. And so the whole gospel, the whole story in Mark is supposed to be teaching us who Jesus is, but it's also supposed to be conforming us to the way of Christ. And so what is this way that that Mark is going to be leading us into, this way of Christ, this way of God in the wilderness? Well, there's really two different figures that we get in the book of Isaiah, particularly Isaiah 40 moving to the end, is we get the powerful deliverer, the Messiah, or the Christ, which we already talked about in the last video. This is the deliverer sent by God to do mighty acts of deliverance in order to deliver the people from whatever is happening, the slavery, the oppression, just a bad situation. The Messiah is supposed to come in power. But then we also get this other figure, which is the suffering servant. It is the one that bears the sin, bears the consequences, bears the load of the unrighteousness of Israel and also the unrighteousness of the whole world. And the figure of the suffering servant, when you read through it, it's kind of confusing. Is it the prophet himself? Is it the people Israel? Is it someone else? And so you get these a lot of different kind of perspectives on who the suffering servant is. But up to the time of Jesus, these two figures were thought to be different people. Is that the Messiah who came in power was going to be kind of someone who's going to lead the people, and then the suffering servant was a different person. But in Christ, we actually get those two things put together, and that was kind of a revolution. People in Israel were not ready for those two things to be put together. And the way Mark kind of explains how these two things are put together is in what we can call the geography of discipleship. Is throughout the story, you have Jesus moving north and south, from Galilee in the north and Jerusalem and Judea in the south. And you even get this at the beginning when you're told that John is baptizing all the people in Judea, and all the people in Jerusalem are coming out to see him in the Jordan River. And that's in the south. But then we're told that Jesus appears from Galilee in the north. Right. And so it's kind of like he comes out of nowhere and enters into the baptism that John's doing. And then, of course, he goes back to the north. And so he kind of starts his ministry by being baptized in the south, kind of where the power center is. But kind of he starts doing his own thing in the north, where he goes back up to the city of Capernaum in chapter 1. He preaches with authority. He casts out demons, and then he starts going around to all the different villages in the north. And we get this kind of the Messiah in great power, casting out demons and doing all sorts of things. But then in the second half of the gospel, you get this transition where you get all these stories of Jesus on his way from the north from Galilee in the north to Jerusalem in the south. And this is where you get all the hard sayings of Jesus, reminding his disciples to count the cost, to remember that he's going to Jerusalem to die. And in the south, you really get the suffering servant, that Jesus has come not to be served, but rather to serve many and to offer his life as a ransom for many. And those are all the things that happen in the south. And so we really need to pay attention as we read through the Gospel of Mark, that there is this geography of discipleship, and that there are these two things, is that there is the power of Christ that is being offered to us for our salvation, but there's also the suffering of Christ, and that we are supposed to live into those two things. And too often, I think we separate those two things instead of living into the power or the might of Christ. We just kind of live this life as if it's just one of suffering, and it's just a biding of time until we die and go to heaven, or that life is kind of mostly a tragedy and there's not that much victory. And then others of us just kind of live in the north, is that we just live from victory to victory, and we just have this expectation that everything should be victory. And then when it's not, there's disappointment. And that's because we've forgotten the suffering servant, that we too live in the in-between times. So as you're reading through the Gospel of Mark, as I hope you are, we're doing one chapter a week as a church, and anyone else who wants to participate, just be mindful of the geography of what's happening. And it's more than just north and south. It's also in the cities and in the country. It's in the Jewish areas, and it's in the Gentile areas. And so Jesus does different things depending on where he is. So stay tuned, and we will continue working through the Gospel of Mark.